Hello, X Class. Nice to see you on this September 8th. Pretty nice day outside after a nice long weekend for a lot of us. Good to be together. Hey, I know I've mentioned this a whole bunch of times by now. You've heard me say this over and over again, but I want to thank you one more time for your faithfulness in watching the videos we put out. I try not to be obsessed with things like attendance or views, but it's simply, I guess, I just want you to know it's heartwarming for us to know that you're out there watching. So when I clicked back through YouTube videos and saw how many times the most recent video had been watched, it just, I don't know, it simply makes this process of prepping for a video and making a video absolutely 100% totally worthwhile from our end. So, Mom, if that's you watching this video over and over again, please don't say anything because, anyways, it just makes me feel great. Thanks, though. Anyhow, today we have another set of terrific readings. You've heard me say this countless times over the years, but I want to say it again. There just are some weeks when I sit down with the readings and I think, not totally sure what to do here. And then there are other weeks where I think, oof, tough to choose between readings this week because so many ideas are popping in my head. Again, that's not to say that some readings are good and some readings are bad. They're all in the Bible. God had these sacred writers write holy things, and they've been passed down from generation to generation. Some just produce ideas in my mind for a sermon, and some don't. So when I have weeks when I've got options, it's wonderful. This week is definitely one of those. The Old Testament reading is one of my favorite readings from the book of Genesis. Not because it's all that exciting for me what's going on, but because the application to life in 21st century America is one that makes a ton of sense. It's a very necessary corrective for how we often view what our lives under God's care should look like. So I love the Old Testament reading. I also love the gospel reading this week. This is a parable from Jesus, and it's a parable that is not meant to warm our hearts. It's meant to caution our hearts and make us think really, really hard about what it means to be a forgiven child of God. The epistle reading is good too. I like it a lot. It's one that maybe had the other readings not been so amazing, I might be thinking about preaching on this coming weekend. But because the Old Testament gospel reading are so good, at least to me, jumping off the page with sermon ideas. Anyways, it's a good week to be the preacher. I want to start with our gospel reading, as we always do. I'm going to read to you from Matthew chapter 18. This is kind of on the long side of parables. As you probably know, some of Jesus' parables are 2 sentences. Some of Jesus' parables are multiple paragraphs, and this would be one of those. It starts with a question from Peter coming up to Jesus, asking him about forgiveness, and Jesus answers not just with numbers, but he answers with a story. So this is Matthew 18:21 through 35. Then Peter came up and said to him, Lord, how often will my brother sin against me and I forgive him? As many as 7 times? Jesus said to him, I do not say to you 7 times, but 70 times 7. Therefore the kingdom of heaven may be compared to a king who wished to settle accounts with his servants. When he began to settle, one was brought to him who owed him 10,000 talents. And since he could not pay, his master ordered him to be sold with his wife and children and all that he had, and payment to be made. So the servant fell on his knees, imploring him, Have patience with me, and I will pay you everything. And out of pity for him, the master of that servant released him and forgave him the debt. But when that same servant went out, he found one of his fellow servants who owed him 100 denarii, and seizing him, he began to choke him, saying, Pay what you owe. So his fellow servant fell down and pleaded with him, Have patience with me, and I will pay you. He refused, and went and put him in prison until he should pay the debt. When his fellow servants saw what had taken place, they were greatly distressed, and they went and reported to their master all that had taken place. Then his master summoned him and said to him, You wicked servant, I forgave you all that debt because you pleaded with me. And should not you have had mercy on your fellow servant, as I had mercy on you? And in anger his master delivered him to the jailers until he should pay all his debt. So also my heavenly Father will do to every one of you if you do not forgive your brother from your heart. Probably a familiar parable for a lot of us. The scene is pretty clear. So first of all, you have Peter coming up to Jesus and asking him, should I be so generous with forgiveness that I forgive someone 7 times? Jesus has just had the conversation with them about being forgiving, about seeking forgiveness, about asking for mercy when you mess up. That we've just had the section about trying to take care of problems quietly, not moving straight to rumor, but going to someone who owes you or has sinned against you and trying to take care of it that way. And if they don't change, bringing a couple people and then bringing a gathering, trying to win that person back. So Peter responds to that by saying, hey, well, should I go way above and beyond the call of duty and be willing to forgive someone even 7 times? And Jesus says, not 7, but 70 times 7, which really doesn't mean exactly 490 times. So like if you've gotten to time 491 with someone, you shouldn't say, done my duty. It's probably kind of an exaggerated way of Jesus saying even more. The number that you think is a ton, 7. Let's blow that number away and go for a crazy number. One of the things I want you to know, since you and I deal not in talents nor denarii when it comes to payment, I want to do sort of a quick check on what that would mean mathematically for us. I'm not exactly sure what the inflation rate is from the year that Jesus said this until the year 2020, but let's just say the first debt. So the king is calling accounts to himself. The servant is brought in. The amount of money that person owes is, let's just say, $60 million. The point is, it is an impossible amount of money. It would be impossible to borrow that much money. It would almost be impossible to spend that much money. It is no doubt impossible to pay back that much money. It is an absolutely crippling debt. As you hear inside the parable, one way that debts could be repaid is if you owe that much debt and can't pay it back, you could be sold. You could be, your entire family could be sold into something like indentured servitude. Another way of paying debts, you could be thrown into a debtor's prison where you beg through the bars. People might give you a penny or a nickel, and eventually maybe you can work your way out of prison. This kind of money is obviously way, 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 way too much. The second guy, the servant who owes the other servant, he owes an amount of money that you and I would consider significant, but not astronomical. So a denarii is a typical wage for a day's work, and so he owes him a portion of a year. Maybe he owes him 3 or 4 months worth of his salary. It would be maybe the equivalent to a car payment that you or I might have. So it's money, it's real money, but it's not a crippling debt. One of the things that is true in parables often is that parables often include what you and I would consider an out of place detail. A detail that kind of like makes us go, what? This is that detail in this parable. When Jesus' first hearers would have heard this, people who knew how much a talent was, people who knew how much a denarius was worth, they would have known that this first guy who was called before the king owed an absolutely insurmountable debt. That debt is forgiven. He doesn't get put on a long payment plan. The king forgives him. The guy asked for patience, and the king gives mercy. Complete and utter forgiveness of the debt. Of course, as you know, He then leaves the king's presence, bumps into this person who owes him money, but not an insurmountable debt. He refuses to be merciful and has that person tossed in jail. When the king hears about it, he is furious, calls him before him, says, I had mercy on you. Oughtn't you to have had mercy on someone else? And he revokes his forgiveness of that person and has that person, tossed into prison. I mentioned the out of place detail. One of the reasons why that's important with parables is because parables are meant to be easy to remember, but something that you and I continuously struggle with our entire life in order to apply it to our lives. That doesn't mean we don't understand it. What it means is because it's so easily memorable that it bubbles up to the surface in our hearts and in our minds when we think through life. Meaning, when you and I read the parable of the Good Samaritan, we know exactly what's being taught there. We're being taught that our neighbor doesn't mean the person who lives next door to us. Our neighbor doesn't mean someone who looks just like us. That everyone we encounter in life is our neighbor, and that we're supposed to treat them with generosity and care and compassion. So we get the point of the parable. But because it is surprising that here's someone who, just by virtue of how life works, wouldn't have liked each other, a Jewish person and a Samaritan person. It's something that bubbles up inside of our memories often if we've heard the parable correctly, and that we should remember, ooh, is this a moment that I'm being called on to be the Good Samaritan? Something that is easy to remember, but continuously bubbles up in our lives because we wonder often if this is a moment when we should be applying that. Same kind of thing is true here. The point is utterly clear that as people who have been forgiven a great debt, that we ought to be radically generous with forgiveness. That out of place detail, the colossal amounts of money owed by the first person, it was supposed to remind them that, hey, Jesus is not giving an economic lesson here. No one would have heard this parable and thought to themselves, all right, I shouldn't borrow $60 million. I shouldn't spend lavishly because it might hurt my future. They are completely aware that the number is so high that they're not talking about money. They're talking about the debt of sin that everyone owes before God. So Jesus isn't giving helpful advice on how to manage household income. He's not talking about where and how to take out debts. He's talking about forgiveness and sin. One of the things that you and I know, but we need to remind ourselves of often, is that no matter how good of a person you and I might believe that we are, probably a lot of days we feel like pretty good people. We look around and we see all sorts of crazy going on in the world and we think, oof, I'm so glad I've chosen this very straight, very narrow path. And though we might feel that way and pat ourselves on the back, the reality is that the Bible teaches us clearly that the failure to keep God's law in any way, small or large, is a failure to keep all of God's law, which is to say that you and I owe God an insurmountable debt. There is absolutely nothing we can do to get out from the crushing debt that is on our shoulders when it comes to sin and righteousness before God. The parable reminds us that falling before the king and asking for mercy and patience is the only action that we can muster. And the king is radically, radically forgiving. It's been mentioned a bunch of times, this is true, that when we walk through the sayings of Jesus from the cross on Good Friday, when Jesus says, it is finished, it doesn't just mean the Good Friday service. It doesn't just mean the crucifixion scene. It doesn't just mean his life is over. What it means is the debt is paid. So the truth is that the words, it is finished, that is the same kind of thing that would have been printed on a mortgage or a camel payment that you owed in the first century. When you made your final payment, you'd go and the banker or whoever would write, "It is finished," sort of like a lien paid in full kind of a thing. So, kind of a little tip here that we're not talking about economics, we're talking about spirituality, we're talking about our standing before God. And the message then is exceptionally clear that you and I, having experienced forgiveness from God for an absolutely insurmountable debt, that good news message of grace, the gospel, is absolutely positively meant to change how we act toward others. So this parable really is a warning. There are things we can learn here. We can learn about our standing before God, the debt of sin, the shame and guilt that we should all feel because of it. But the warning is clear that as disciples of Jesus, as followers of God, as Christians, you and I ought to always be mindful of the debt that has been paid for us. Not because we could work our way out of it, but because in the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus, the debt is paid in full. That if you and I leave the presence of God and then get stuck on petty grudges, debts that others owe us, if we fail to forgive, that we are putting our own spiritual safety at risk. Now, the reality is that because we don't see God face to face on a daily basis, you and I might be able to convince ourselves that the debt we owe Him is petty and that the things other people do to us are really significant. But that's really our problem of needing to think about the world in a different way. The reality is the debt that we owe God is great, and the things people have failed to do for us or done to us against us, those are actually petty by comparison. Now, there's a couple things I want to mention just because I want to make sure that we're kind of staying in the right order. It's important to remember that in this parable, the king is the one who forgives first. The reason I mention that is because when you and I hear, just like we hear in the Lord's Prayer, that we ask God to forgive our trespasses as we forgive those who trespass against us. And Jesus, after teaching the Lord's Prayer, reminds his disciples that, hey, if you don't forgive other people, the Father won't forgive you. We can sometimes get a little bit out of order on that, and it can start to feel like our forgiving of other people earns us something before God. But it's important to remember exactly how the parable unfolds. The king forgives first. But that shouldn't remove from us the warning, because the reality is, as people who have been forgiven a great debt before God, if we fail to forgive other people, it looks an awful lot like we are despising God's forgiveness of us. And if we were to despise God's forgiveness of us, you betcha it could be removed. Also, I want to mention, this is really important. You and I are, even as forgiven children of God, we're still sinners living in a sinful world. The reality is that when people have done petty things to us, we might muster the spiritual courage to say, I forgive you, and then we find it kind of coming back up in our minds the next day or the next month, the next year. I wouldn't want that to happen to you and have you think, oh, well, I failed to forgive this petty debt, I must not be forgiven. The reality is, I think one of the things that Jesus is teaching us here is that our emotions need to be taught to follow our decisions and actions. So the truth is, maybe you're thinking right now about someone that you're still angry with, or someone who's done something nasty to you, and you think, I've tried to forgive them, I've tried to forgive them, but it keeps coming back up in my mind. The reality is, I think that's what God is calling us to do. He's calling us to make the conscious effort, make the conscious decision to forgive, and to acknowledge that sometimes our emotions lag behind our choices and our actions. As long as you and I live in a sinful world, we'll struggle to live this. But the point is to remember that God has been unbelievably merciful toward us, and that is meant to shape how we treat other people. If we find ourselves being the kind of person who is never forgiving, there is a danger there that you and I could be despising God's forgiveness. Rather, better to forgive someone over and over and over and over and over again. Maybe that's because they've sinned against you over and over again, or maybe that's just because that's how many times you and I need to wake up in the morning and say, I forgave this person. I need to push aside the feelings I'm having toward them. So anyways, I love that reading. I think it's a great parable. I like parables in general. I love story, and Jesus uses these stories in a masterful way to tell his disciples both then and now about the radical changing power that forgiveness is meant to bring to our lives. All right, I'm going to read to you from the book of Romans. This is our epistle reading. As you might recall, we've been in Romans for, like 15 weeks now, which is great. I love when we have the chance to walk through a book of the Bible in church, even if it's section by section, even if we don't hear from it every week during the sermon. I just think it's a positive thing to be in a book for a long time. So I'm going to read to you from Romans chapter 14, verses 1 through 12. As for the one who is weak in faith, welcome him, but not to quarrel over opinions. One person believes he may eat anything, while the weak person eats only vegetables. That's very important to me that people know that that's in the Bible, right? So the next time I'm eating steak with a side of hamburger and bacon, don't judge. Let not the one who eats despise the one who abstains, and let not the one who abstains pass judgment on the one who eats, for God has welcomed him. Who are you to pass judgment on the servant of another? It is before his own master that he stands or falls, and he will be upheld, for the Lord is able to make him stand. One person esteems one day as better than another, while another esteems all days alike. Each one should be fully convinced in his own mind. The one who observes the day observes it in honor of the Lord. The one who eats, eats in honor of the Lord, since he gives thanks to God, while the one who abstains, abstains in honor of the Lord and gives thanks to God. For none of us lives to himself, and none of us dies to himself. If we live to the Lord, and if we die to the Lord. So then, whether we live or whether we die, we are the Lord's. For to this end Christ died and lived again, that he might be Lord both of the dead and of the living. Why do you pass judgment on your brother? Or you, why do you despise your brother? For we will all stand before the judgment seat of God, for it is written, As I live, says the Lord, every knee shall bow to me, and every tongue shall confess to God. So then, each of us will give an account of himself to God. You might recall, just as we've talked through epistle readings, as we've talked through the book of Acts, that one of the enormous struggles of the first century, still in every century, but it was a huge struggle in the first century, was how Jewish Christians and Gentile Christians got along. That's one of the things that Paul has to deal with really often. So you might remember early in the book of Acts, this happens right away. People accuse the disciples of giving more food away to the Jewish widows than to the Gentile widows. So there's this struggle in the early church to decide just how Jewish a Christian had to be. This is kind of the problem you might remember in a place like Galatia. So in Galatia, people have come in after Paul has already taught them the truth, saying, well, yeah, all that stuff about Jesus and the gospel is true, but you also have to be circumcised. You also have to follow the food regulations of the Old Testament. You also have to follow the religious calendar of the Old Testament. And what Paul is saying is, no, it's not Jesus plus these Old Testament regulations. It's Jesus. It's forgiveness of sins in Jesus. So you hear a similar kind of thing here in Romans, where what Paul is saying is, hey, you want to follow a certain set of dietary regulations? Go ahead. You want to not do that? That's fine too. As long as neither one of those two people is judging the other, and as long as whatever you're doing, you're attempting to do for God's glory. The same kind of thing, it's not just true of food. It's also true of holidays, what you and I might think of as religious feasts or festivals. Some churches want to have Advent services and Lenten services. Great. As long as you're doing it to God's glory, that's wonderful. Some churches don't do that. Is that okay? Yeah, I think so. I think it is. So some churches have only Christmas Eve services. Some churches have Christmas Day services. Both are fine. You shouldn't judge the other one as long as they're both being done to God's glory. So he doesn't specifically talk as much here about circumcision, but there you have the dietary regulations, the day kind of regulations. The point of Paul here in Romans, as he makes in a lot of places, is, hey, some of the ceremonial law stuff, it just doesn't matter. If you want to do it, fine, but it's not a gateway to the gospel. It's not a necessity. If it helps you by creating some devotion to God, hey, go for it. You and I don't live with the kinds of regulations that they did in the first century, but there might be other kinds of things that you could easily think about where, for some people, spending time opening their Bible every single day and reading a chapter is a spiritually valuable, rewarding thing for them. Good. That's great. Hope they do that. Hope they continue to do that to God's glory. Someone else, listens to God's word on the weekend when they're in church and spends time thinking about it, trying to apply it. They go about it a different way. Can that be done to God's glory too? You betcha. It's just dangerous to judge someone else's ways of devotion. More important to be supportive of one another and to acknowledge that the church is centered on the confession of Jesus as Savior and Lord, not on exactly what you wear when you show up for worship, exactly what you eat on your way home from worship. Those kinds of things, they just don't actually matter as much in the grand scheme. All right, I mentioned that I like that reading, but I like the other readings even better, so I'm jumping ship from Romans, and I'm going to read to you from Genesis, our Old Testament reading for the day. I'm reading to you from Genesis chapter 50. This is almost the very end of the book of Genesis. The only thing that happens afterwards is the death of Joseph is recorded. So this is Genesis 50, verses 15 through 21. When Joseph's brothers saw that their father was dead, they say, "It may be that Joseph will hate us and pay us back for all the evil that we did to him." So they sent a message to Joseph saying, "Your father gave this command before he died. Say to Joseph, please forgive the transgression of your brothers and their sin, because they did evil to you. And now please forgive the transgression of the servants of the God of your father." Joseph wept when they spoke to him. His brothers also came and fell down before him and said, "Behold, we are your servants." But Joseph said to them, "Do not fear, for am I in the place of God? As for you, you meant evil against me, but God meant it for good, to bring it about that many people should be kept alive as they are today. So do not fear, I will provide for you and your little ones." Thus he comforted them and spoke kindly to them. There's a couple things that I think are really important about this reading. Just a quick reminder of the life of Joseph. So you remember Joseph was kind of a bratty brother to his siblings. He was the favorite in the household, and they disliked it so much that they actually sell him into slavery. They beat him up, throw him in a pit, and instead of killing him, they say, "Hey, well, let's just sell him as a slave." Joseph's life amazingly doesn't improve from there. He ends up being a servant in an important house in Egypt. Then he's falsely accused of rape or sexual harassment, something like that. Winds up in prison. He gets left in prison even after he ought to have been remembered, and so he's had a pretty tough go. But then through the interpretation of some of Pharaoh's dreams, he rises to incredible prominence in Egypt. And as part of that position, what he does is he starts saving up all sorts of food because there is going to be a great famine. That's what God has revealed to Joseph through Pharaoh's dreams. And so Joseph goes on this incredible plan of gathering all sorts of grain so that the people can be fed even during a time of drought and famine. And it just so happens to be that Joseph's brothers come all the way to Egypt knowing that there's food there, only to find that the person whose hand their lives are in, or this person that they beat and sold into slavery. And so you have here this moment where because their father is dead, they're afraid that their brother will turn against them. But here Joseph offers them a remarkable, remarkable mercy by saying, hey, you meant it for evil, but God meant it for good. So I want to make a couple of comments about this. This is actually a passage of the Bible that I feel like I talk about with people a lot. Not in Bible study setting, not in sermon setting, but this is like a pastoral care verse for me that I use really often. The reason I do that is because so often in life, you and I find ourselves not understanding God's plan for our lives. And this is the moment in the Bible that I typically point people to. I say, hey, you've got all sorts of bad stuff happening in your life. Again, diagnosis, loss of a loved one, all sorts of terrible things that happen to us. And you and I sit back and just say, how can this possibly be God's plan? I've read in the Bible that God works all things for good for those who love him. And this is not good. This is really, really bad. And what I try to point people to is this moment in the book of Genesis, where it is only after decades and decades of going through hardship, being beaten and abused by your siblings, thrown into a pit, before you're left for dead, you're sold into slavery, falsely accused, imprisoned, left to rot in prison. This is a tough go. Joseph has a tough go. And yet, after years and years and years and years and years, he begins to understand what his role is when his family comes back to him, and it's actually in his power to feed them or let them die. And he realizes then that even though all this bad stuff happened to him, God meant it for good. The reason I tell people that so often is because really often we want to know what God's plan is for us right now. We want to know how God's at work in the world right now. But the Bible doesn't teach us that that's how God reveals it to us. This is a really good example of that. Sometimes the truth is you and I might actually close our eyes for the last time in this life, not seeing the fullness of God's plan. We might only see it when we get to heaven. Or maybe there's moments like this where you and I live through decades of hardship only to see what God was up to in the past. I had a friend tell me one time, I really like this, so I stole it. He said that oftentimes his Christian friends seem to see God's plan through their windshield. They're driving right toward it. He said he tends to see God's plan in his rearview mirror. And I really like that. That makes a lot of sense to me. That actually is the biblical example of how you and I get to experience God's plan. Not typically in front of us, not to say it never happens, but the biblical example is that we tend to see God's plan in the rearview mirror. And in fact, a rearview mirror that can look way, 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 way back. So I think it's an important example for us that even though we might not understand what God is up to, that you and I are meant to be patient and are meant to trust that God is actually working for good, for us, for his people, for his church. Even if we don't see it, we're supposed to be patient. We're supposed to be trusting. I also want you to note about Joseph that Joseph does not claim victimhood here. Joseph has been absolutely wronged by others. Not to say that, he didn't deserve like a punch in the jaw from one of his brothers. That could have happened and I would have been totally cool with it. But the way his brothers treated him was bad. The way Potiphar's wife treats him is bad. The way that he's treated in prison, not great. But Joseph here does not claim being a victim. Even though he could claim victimhood, he continues to use his life to honor God and then sees that God is working through him to bring real, lived salvation to others. Oftentimes when we walk through these readings in Acts class, one of the things we do is we try to think, why is it that this reading is today? To me, this is a pretty good example of Joseph is how a forgiven servant is meant to be. Doesn't think about the way his brothers wronged him, that small debt. He thinks about the fact that in the grand scheme of things, the debt he owes before God is enormous, and yet God has had mercy on him. Because of that, when given the opportunity, he has mercy on his brothers. He is how the servant should have been in Jesus' parable. Forgiven by the king, then goes and forgives others. He is a great example of that. Anyhow, great to be with you. God bless your week. Hope you enjoy watching. I'm looking forward to the weekend already, thinking about these great readings and how I might bring them, boil them up into a sermon. I look forward to you having the chance to hear that and me having the chance to preach it. So God bless you. See you soon.